So let's formally start today's workshop. And I would formally like to welcome Dr. Madhan Mohan Jaganathan. And I think he is the best resource person we could get for our interns when it comes to guiding them to how to write a research proposal. So before starting, before handing over the space to Dr. Jaganathan, I would like to introduce him to our interns. Dr. Madan Mohan Jagannathan is an assistant professor at the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, JNU. He holds his MSc in physics and MA in political science from Madras Christian College. He has an MPhil and a PhD in international politics from Jawaharlal University. Dr. Jagannathan has publications in international journals, Conflict, Security and Development, Global Society and Third World Quarterly. Currently, he's a co-editor of International Political Sociology, a journal supported by International Studies Association and published by Oxford Academic, Oxford University Press. He has convened panels and presented papers in the annual conferences of the British International Studies Association. He has also presented papers in the annual conventions of the International Studies Association. So welcome, sir. We are glad to have you with us today. And I hand over the space to you now.
Thank you very much. Good evening to everyone who has gathered here. So as you know, the title of this lecture is, quote, "The nuts and bolts of writing a research proposal," unquote. Nuts and bolts implying practical or basic details. If we try to change the title of this lecture into a question, into a puzzling question, which provides a direction, because any question would provide a direction to the course of the lecture. The question would be, why are we focusing on the practical details of a research proposal? Given that the theme or the genre of research methods is philosophically anchored or grounded. I have tried my best to convert the title of the lecture into a puzzling question. And the answer to this question is simple. Despite a grounding or a training in the philosophical foundations of research, the basic points, the practical details, the nuances, the nitty-gritties, howsoever you may label it, whatever you may call it, these are invariably missing when it comes to writing a research proposal. What explains the disconnect? The disconnect between philosophical foundations and practical details, which are so necessary in writing a research proposal. Why are philosophical foundations merely read without being internalized and implemented? Certainly, the disconnect is not always discernible or observable. There are exceptions. Good, robust, persuasive, and convincing research proposals do make it and succeed. However, I speak from my experience. And this lecture seeks to minimize the disconnect, if not eliminate, between philosophical understanding and the practical aspects of a research proposal. Now, what are the basic steps in writing a good research proposal? What are the essential building blocks in writing a good research proposal or a synopsis, as the case may be? Mind you, I think we are supposed to write a research proposal or a synopsis as per the requirements. What is the length of the proposal that is mandated? We should adhere to the word limit strictly, religiously, faithfully. So depending on what the word limit is, we need to tailor our research proposal or a synopsis. A full-fledged PhD synopsis in the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, as Professor Kanti Bajpai would say, runs exactly to 13 pages, 1-3, excluding the bibliography. Maybe if you're writing a research proposal to a university in UK for a PhD admission or elsewhere, it could be 4 pages, it could be 1,000 words, it could be 500 words, it could be 300 words. I think so. I think you are also being tested. We are also being tested in terms of how faithful we are in terms of meeting this requirement. So that has to be kept in mind. Now, in terms of the basic steps that go into writing a research proposal, the first step, and before we get into that first step, what is a first baby step? The first baby step, I would say, is to identify and specify the dependent variable. I distinctly remember the words of Professor Kanti Bajpai here, when he would say the first step is to crack the dependent variable. Is dependent variable a jargon? Is it a mathematical jargon? Let us demystify the dependent variable a bit. So what is the dependent variable? In a simple mathematical equation, y is equal to f of x, which would mean the function of x plus c, where c is equal to a constant. Y is a dependent variable because the value of y in this particular equation depends on the value of x. In fact, the value of y changes or varies with the value of x. And therefore, y is the dependent variable. So that is as far as it goes when it comes to the mathematical equation. In social science research, the dependent variable is a phenomenon of investigation. So that is how it may well translate from a natural science setting to a social science context. So I think right at the outset, from the very beginning, from the word go, we need to be clear. We need to be pretty clear as to what is the phenomenon that we as a researcher or you as a researcher seek to understand or explain. Now, again, I think it is important to highlight that for some scholars, the explanatory and understanding traditions are different. They are very different. I think what I have in mind is as a seminal text, a masterpiece by Martin Hollis and Steve Smith, which is titled as Explaining and Understanding International Relations. So we are not getting into the details right here, but to briefly mention the difference, which is that an explanatory tradition may not necessarily historicize. An explanatory tradition may not necessarily get into the insider's view or the nitty-gritties, whereas an understanding tradition probably goes much more deeper. Consider, for instance, the critique on Kenneth Waltz, the Waltzian theory, the critique on Waltzian theory in international politics. I think one of the most outstanding critiques on Kenneth Waltz, his theory of international politics, is that it is ahistorical, and that critique comes from Paul Schroeder, if you remember. And there are several outstanding critiques. We are not getting into those details right now. There is a critique, say, for instance, by Ruggie. There's a critique by Andrew Linklater. There's a critique by Richard Ashley, and so on and so forth. So now getting back to this baby step, the phenomenon that we would seek to investigate, that we wish to explain, that we try to understand whatever it is, that then is our dependent variable. So dependent variable is demystified in this sense. So let us indulge in illustrations. For Emily Durkheim, a sociologist, in one of his research projects, the dependent variable was suicide. So he seeks out to understand as to why suicide and what really explains suicide. What are the independent variables? What are the factors that drive suicide? Is there a link between societal integration or the integration within society and suicide? So for Emily Durkheim, and thereafter he comes with his thesis on suicide, his theory of suicide, different kinds of suicide, altruistic, egoistic, and anomie. But then it all begins with his basic identification of the dependent variable of the phenomenon of investigation, and that is suicide. For Kenneth Walls, theory of international politics, the dependent variable was perhaps international political outcome or state behavior or both. For Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, it was perhaps social exclusion or social subjugation or social suffocation. I mean, you call it, you name it, you have it. Or for Periyar, EVR, or for the subsequent leaders of the Dravida movement, such as C. N. Annadurai or M. Karunanidhi, the dependent variable was, and it continues to be, social injustice. Right? So they begin with that point. How do we explain social injustice? How do we explain social exclusion? And then they attribute that to something else, which has to do with the social order. But that is later. Now we are in this baby step of identifying, of diagnosing, of specifying, of mentioning what the dependent variable is. Mind you, these are my illustrations and interpretations. You may have entirely different examples. You may have an entirely different reading, even on the aforementioned thinkers that I have just mentioned. In the sciences, say for instance, medical science, the dependent variable may be a heart attack, a myocardial infarction, a cardiac arrest. Recently, it could be about the outbreak of COVID-19 as a disease or the origin of COVID-19. That is what ought to be explained. How did COVID-19 came about, the way it came about, the way it caused destruction, for instance. Is it a leakage from the laboratory, or is it from the wet market in Wuhan? Is Wuhan the only laboratory in the world? Are there other laboratories in the world? Has it to do with the kind of research that is going on? What is it? So there are different theories, and I think there are any number of interesting commentaries on this subject. Whatever it may be, whatever the discipline may be, whatever the subject may be, the first baby step is identify and mention your dependent variable. Now, the second baby step, and I would call a baby step because I think we are still not into that very first critical step in research. The second baby step is formulate a question connecting the dependent variable. Pose a question around the dependent variable. What kind of a question? I think this is important. It has to be a researchable question. Not any kind of a question. Not a question which is futuristic. Which party would win the next Lok Sabha elections in this country? That's a futuristic question, right? Which party would win the elections in Gujarat or Himachal Pradesh, whatever it is? That is the domain of psephology, of election analysis. But I mean, here I think we engage primarily with academic questions, a researchable question, a significant question, an exciting question, not a cliched question, not a boring cliched question, not a question which has been raised before by others and adequately addressed. A question, we should pose a question that could bring about value addition. Value addition is critical. Value addition to what? Value addition to the existing pool of knowledge. What is critical here is originality, novelty, creativity, imagination. There is a brilliant document. It's there on the World Wide Web. I mean, you could freely download it. This is by Adam Przeworski and Frank Solomon. Quote on the art of writing proposals, unquote, published by the Social Science Research Council in New York. So as they say, when we raise a question, when we pose a question, when we formulate a question, when we construct a question, what is it that we are trying to say that others have not said before? What is it that we are seeking to ask that others have not asked before? So I think this is important. The value addition dimension is quite important. Let us elaborate a bit more on value addition. We may raise a question that is entirely new, that is groundbreaking, that is path-breaking. This is difficult. We may raise a question by highlighting a dimension that others have not done before. This is possible. We may raise a question that others have raised earlier, but not satisfactorily answered thus far. This is also possible. So the point is to raise or ask or pose or construct a question as much original as possible. And preferably, it is better to raise a puzzling research question. In fact, if you have managed, or if we have managed, or if I have managed to pose or construct or formulate puzzling research question, we have completed the first critical step in writing a research proposal or a synopsis. But what exactly is a puzzle? What exactly is a puzzling research question? And why are puzzles insisted upon? Puzzles are insisted upon because if research design grapples with the puzzle, it may culminate in value addition. The probability is much higher that it may culminate in value addition. And what exactly is a puzzle? What is a puzzle, literally speaking? A puzzle is something that intrigues us. A puzzle is something that baffles us. A puzzle is something that excites us. A puzzle is something that indicates a disconnect. There is something amiss here, right? And so I think the best article on this is by Dina Zins, 3 Puzzles in Search of a Researcher, which is in fact the presidential speech given by Dina Zins at the International Studies Association, one of the conferences. So if, I don't know, I think some of you may have read Dina Zins, but I think an important point that Dina Zins highlights in that article, and I think what is being highlighted is, for instance, when she, I think it is she, and when she returns home from office on day 1, for instance, she comes across a signboard which indicates that there is a flat for sale, a flat in British English, apartment in American English. So no puzzle here. Of course, a flat can be for sale. And then after a few days, when she returns home, when she's on her way home from office, The signboard disappears. No puzzle here because maybe someone has bought that flat. After a few days, when she is on her way back home from office, the signboard reappears, a flat for sale. So this is where the puzzle begins. If the flat has been bought by someone, why is a signboard reappearing? This is not something that is normal. This is not something that is logical. Or maybe it is logical, and maybe she's not probably getting it. So what she uh, does then is to try and tell her stories to herself as to what could have potentially happened. Maybe someone was tantalizingly close to buying this flat, and then he or she could not buy that flat. So in the last minute, the flat which was about to be sold could not be sold, and thus the signboard reappears. That's explanation one, a plausible explanation, a potential explanation. So in research, and of course, she could come up with several such stories, several such possibilities. So in research, I think what we also try to do, what we also grapple with is we come with our own explanations, tentative explanations, what we call as a hunch, what we call as a hypothesis, a tentative proposition, which is subject to testing. We'll come to that a little later. But I think the important takeaway from the article by Dina Zins is that a puzzle indicates a disconnect between what is normally expected, what is a general expectation, and what you get to see otherwise. Say, for instance, in a social science setting, it could be any society, but why do we witness systematic attacks on the vulnerable sections of society in a society which claims to be grounded on principles of equality or justice or non-violence or whatever it is? So at one level, there is a rhetoric of democracy. Maybe there is a rhetoric of justice. There is a rhetoric of, say, for instance, non-violence. But on the other hand, there is the reality of violence, the violence on women, the violence on the vulnerable sections of society, the violence on poor, the violence on the elderly population, the violence on the socially marginalized sections of society. It could be any society for that matter, but that's not important. But how do we grapple with this? The disconnect between what is expected in a society which claims to be grounded in certain principles and which witnesses completely different. It could be any society, any country, any sovereign state in any part of the world. So this is one illustration of a puzzle. We could think of several other puzzles. I mean, puzzle need not be something that is as sophisticated, as substantive, as loaded as what I'm trying to say. I mean, one of my students used to say that the fact that I did not have a car at that point of time, I do not have a car at this point of time, probably I'll never have a car at any point of time, that constitutes a research puzzle. Because a general expectation is that any faculty member in JNU would have a car, and because most faculty members do have a car, and therefore the fact that I don't have a car is an anomaly, is a break, it's a disconnect from a normal expectation. That is a puzzle. Say, for instance, when it comes to COVID-19, the pandemic crisis, I think what comes across to many of us especially in society, is that if suppose an individual has taken the complete dose of vaccine, the first, second, and then the precaution dose, then how does that individual get infection thereafter? Or maybe after the second dose or after the third dose? Because so at some level, it is puzzling for any person, for the common society, But mind you, puzzle is something that comes to us at the beginning. And here we are right now in the very beginning of our research endeavor, in the very beginning of our research project. What is a research proposal? What is a synopsis? It is a plan, but it's a convincing plan. It ought to be a persuasive plan. This research proposal may be to Social Science Research Council based in New York. This research proposal may be to get an admission for a PhD at Cambridge or the London School of Economics or to JNU or wherever. But I think the most important requirement of any research proposal or a synopsis is how convincing it is, how persuasive it is, how robust it is, not to you, not to me, but to the larger selection committee. So puzzle is something that we stumble upon right at the beginning. But towards the end of the research, we do get answers to this perplexing puzzle. And again, research then does not end with a concrete, definitive answer, especially in social science or probably even in natural science. In the case of the pandemic crisis, in the case of SARS-CoV-2 virus or the COVID-19 as a disease, so some people get infected with COVID-19 in terms of the disease, despite vaccination. So there is a term that explains that, and that's a breakthrough infection. So what is the rationale for vaccination? For instance, the rationale is simple. So even if you get infected despite vaccination, you may not necessarily lead in a hospital. You may not become as critical as you may be without any vaccination. So I think there is a certain logic. One can agree to it, one can disagree with it, but I think a scientific viewpoint would go along in terms of endorsing the rationale for vaccination by and large, right? Of course, that's a different discussion altogether, because certain vaccines, then we are in the realm of the side effects, the adverse effects, and adverse effects. What is the number that we are talking about? Is it 0.6 in a million for certain vaccines, such as Covishield in India? So I think we are probably heading towards a different discussion. So the first important step is to formulate a puzzling research quest. The moment we have done that, we are, I think, off to a very exciting start in research. The second important step in writing a research proposal, in writing a synopsis, and I'm trying to focus on certain things which have not been necessarily stated, say, for instance, in the art of writing research proposals, that you may get it on the internet. But these are said before. There is nothing original in what I'm saying. Is that hypothesis, the second point. Now, whether you really need to have a hypothesis, is it mandatory? Is it compulsory? Is it like, as Paul Feyerabend says, anything goes? Are the other rules of the game way too tyrannical? Aren't they way too tyrannical? Are they way too regimented? We can get into a discussion. Some scholars argue that hypothesis is not required. But I think by and large, it may be useful to formulate a working hypothesis. Now, what exactly is a hypothesis? I think there are several ways in which we could understand what a hypothesis is. In very simple terms, at a very basic level, a hypothesis is a tentative answer to your research question. At a more substantive level, one could argue that a hypothesis is a falsifiable proposition. A hypothesis ought to be a falsifiable proposition. Now, you cannot make this requirement a dogma. I mean, I think it's important that you don't make this requirement a dogma, that it ought to be a falsifiable proposition always, because I think by and large, it is better if the hypothesis is a falsifiable proposition. But at the very least, a hypothesis should never indicate that a researcher has a preconceived notion, a preconceived end. So quite often, I think we come across researchers who have already made up their minds as to what the conclusion would be. So I think at least that must not be the case. I think that is very important. Now, the question is, we are getting into the philosophy of formulating a hypothesis, the philosophical foundation as to why a hypothesis ought to be a falsifiable proposition. This comes from Karl Popper. So it is not as if when we are getting into the nuts and bolts, the nuts and bolts do have their origin, do have their genesis, do have their rationale, do have their logic in certain philosophical tenets, certain philosophical foundations. For Karl Popper, in one of his lectures, I think delivered at Cambridge, the bottom line is that for a theory to be considered as scientific, the theory ought to be testable or refutable or falsifiable. He uses exactly these three words, nothing original in what I'm saying. This is if you want to consider a theory as scientific. Now, if theory for the moment is considered as a hypothesis, because we are in the business right now of rendering our research scientific, we can go and mount a scathing critique on science, but I think that's not useful. So I think the purpose is to render social research scientific. And if you ask Karl Popper, he would say that for a theory, for a hypothesis to be deemed as scientific, it ought to be testable or refutable or falsified. Right? Karl Popper does not end with this. He mounts a scathing critique on, for instance, the most popular theories of his time. And that includes a theory by Karl Marx. That includes a theory by Sigmund Freud. That includes a theory by Alfred Adler. Karl Marx in terms of history, and I think Sigmund Freud in terms of individual behavior, psychological behavior, and Alfred Adler, again, individual psychology. Now, for Popper, these theories may be the most popular theories. Fantastic, but they are not scientific. They are not scientific because these theories seem to be explaining everything. Anything and everything. These theories seem to be explaining anything and everything. Right? That is not what a theory is supposed to do. A scientific theory is not supposed to do this. A scientific theory, a scientifically formulated hypothesis, in its formulation, should demonstrate a potential for falsifiability, the scope for falsification. So these theories do not seem to be doing that, whereas Einstein's theory of relativity, Einstein's theory of gravitation, which is demonstrated via Eddington's eclipse observation, does it. And Popper says that's not because Einstein's theory is from physics and the rest of the theories are from social science. That's not the point. The point is something else, which is that there is no element of risk-taking in the theories that we have just mentioned, Karl Marx theory, Alfred Adler's theory, Sigmund Freud's theory. Whereas Einstein takes a huge leap. Einstein takes a risk which is that he is resting his theory. He's resting the confirmation of his theory or a potential falsification of his theory based on the Eddington's eclipse observation. We are not getting into the details right now. So what does it amount to from philosophy to nuts and bolts? When it comes to formulating a hypothesis, we should not be playing it way too safe. Our hypothesis should not be formulated way too ambiguously. You need to take a stance in your hypothesis, a definitive stance. As Professor Varun Sani would say, suppose if you have a hypothesis, most mothers are affectionate. That's not a hypothesis. It's vaguely formulated. Most mothers, that's vague, that's ambiguous, that creates confusion. A hypothesis would then be formulated differently. For instance, quote, all mothers are affectionate. And then probably you could probably come up with any strand of evidence. There are any number of such incidents happening these days, wherein you could demonstrate that a particular mother has inflicted violence on her child, right? So with due regards to women and mother, I mean, I hope that point is not politicized. So in a hypothesis, we need to take a stance, and for taking a stance, we need to take a risk. So this is in terms of philosophy of a hypothesis. But why does it, I think let's spend a couple of minutes. Why should it be a falsifiable proposition? I think the logic, the rationale is also that at the formulation, at the level of formulation, at the level of design, at a very initial stage, unless your hypothesis indicates a potential for falsification, the research, in fact, does not go beyond that point. So it is almost like a car crash test. I don't drive a car, I don't have a car, but any car crash test, you subject the car to a crash test. And then we will get to see as to what happens to the car. And then, of course, safety ratings, safety rankings are given in terms of adult seat, in terms of baby seat. Is it 4-star? Is it 5-star? Are Indian cars, in fact, meeting those standards? There are cars meeting those standards. So similarly, your hypothesis should demonstrate the scope for falsification. And then I think what it means is that your hypothesis should be subjected to 100% scrutiny. In case your hypothesis does not demonstrate any potential for falsification, it will never be subjected to scrutiny. And if it is never subjected to a complete scrutiny, a ruthless scrutiny, then research process does not get carried out in the first place, right? So here is the test. And towards the end of the research, then we would say, so this is how it has happened so far. These were the hypotheses at the beginning of the study. And in fact, these initial propositions were subjected to a thorough scrutiny, a ruthless scrutiny, and these are the inferences. And at the very least, your hypothesis should indicate that they are slightly modified. Because I think many a times we come across a scenario in which students would say that all hypotheses are proved. So these were the hypotheses that were formulated at the beginning of the study. And these are the hypotheses that we arrive at the end of the study. They are same. Maybe that is a possibility, but then it raises questions as to whether research has been carried out faithfully, sincerely, diligently. And I think the most important point when it comes to research is not holding on to our point of view. In fact, Karl Popper would say, when Lakatos interprets Karl Popper, Lakatos says, for Popper, commitment is an outright crime. Why does he say that? Why is commitment an outright crime for Popper? I mean, this is counterintuitive. Isn't this bizarre? But commitment to what? For Popper, if you're committed to your theory, if you're committed to your hypothesis, it's a crime. Because for Popper, what we ought to be committed to is a scientific temperament, is a scientific spirit. We should never be committed to any theory, howsoever grand they may be. If you are committed to a theory way too much, then a theory then becomes an ideology. An ideology then becomes a disaster in practice. So research is not something which we think in a very conventional sense. In a conventional sense, in terms of conventional morality, I mean, I must always thank Professor Andrew Linklater, who has been the most inspiring teacher in terms of his works. He then comes up with his classification of pre-conventional morality, conventional morality, and post-conventional morality, quoting Habermas, quoting Horkheimer in this fantastic text, The Achievements of Critical Theory, in this work, Critical Theory and World Politics. So in a very conventional sense, we would think that, okay, this is the point of view. A hypothesis is a hunch. A hypothesis is an answer. To this question, this is the answer we have. And we should somehow hold on to this. We should somehow cling on to this. No, we should be able to, we should give up on the face of contrary evidence. The extent to which a researcher is willing to give up his or her hypothesis on the face of contrary evidence, to that extent, the quality of research is enhanced. Right. So I think that's the difference here. And that's why it sounds quite counterintuitive, and it is counterintuitive. So it is not about confirmation. And the brilliance of Karl Popper is actually to shift the nature of the game, the name of the game, from confirmation, from verification to falsification, to refutation. Okay, so this is in terms of philosophy of a hypothesis. Thereafter, let's spend a little time in terms of how do we formulate a hypothesis. A hypothesis, at the very least, should have at least 3 variables. At least 3. The first variable, of course, we have seen, and I think that is a dependent variable, and that is what we seek to explain. That is what we seek to understand. But I think the more significant variable when it comes to a hypothesis is the independent variable. So whenever you attribute a factor, a variable, as to why a certain thing occurs, say for instance, the outbreak of COVID-19, or maybe a heart attack, or maybe violence in society, or maybe social exclusion. So social exclusion is a dependent variable, say for instance. So what is the independent variable? So here the independent variable is where you can actually come up with your original thinking, your original contribution. So there is exclusion, there is subjugation. We are not saying necessarily, for instance, that it necessarily ought to do with an external colonial rule. Because there was exclusion even prior to colonial rule, according to a certain perspective. So in this case, exclusion, social exclusion can be attributed to a social order which is hierarchical, a social order which is discriminatory, a social order which is parochial, a social order which is patriarchal, a social order which is regimented. So then you connect that because of the social order, what we do find is a social exclusion. And this social exclusion does not seem to go despite independence. And that's why it's not just about political independence. Political independence is necessary. It's an achievement, an accomplishment. But I think what is also important is social independence. Or maybe these are just perspectives. I'm just coming up with illustration. Or maybe for Ken Booth, the dependent variable is emancipation, liberation from social, physical, and political constraints. One could have a critique on emancipation, that's different. But what leads to this emancipation? What could facilitate emancipation? That could be the independent variable. So the independent variable is where the researcher proposes that so far, so many factors have been attributed to this phenomenon. But here am I trying to attribute a different factor, a novel factor. And this factor has not been highlighted so far, right? So at a point of time, for instance, when it comes to Indian politics, coalition politics was always considered as not so stable. But then there was an alternative argument, which is that coalition politics brings stability. You could turn around and say that this is where it makes a difference. So a hypothesis would have an independent variable that is very significant. That is where, in fact, you actually make a contribution or an original contribution. This variable, this factor has not been proposed so far to this extent. And here am I proposing this. And this is connected to the dependent variable, what I want to explain or what I want to understand. Now, how is this independent variable, the factor or the variable that I am proposing, connected to this dependent variable? By means of an intervening variable, the variable that comes in between. One of those very important texts, a lucidly written text, Political Science Research Methods by Johnson and Jocelyn. A very simple illustration, not a controversial illustration. Political participation is a dependent variable. You could measure political participation in terms of electoral participation. Now, what is it that leads to political participation? What is it that drives political participation? You could have a working hypothesis to the effect that it has to do with the level of education. So the level of education is the independent variable. Political participation is a dependent variable. And the intervening variable would be nothing original in what I'm saying. It's there in Johnson and Jocelyn. Political awareness. So education, by creating political awareness, leads to political participation. So now you may ask, but not necessarily. Most educated people do not vote. But a hypothesis, mind you, does not have to be proved at all. That's the best part about a hypothesis. The more you disprove it, the more it is better. The hypothesis could be disproved, which then indicates that a researcher is entitled to any point of view. I don't think anyone could, in fact, impose a certain point of view on the research, and that point of view could always be falsified, could always be refuted. But I think what is being tested in research is the researcher willing to give up his or her initial hunch, initial proposition, initial hypothesis on the face of contrary evidence. If he or she is not willing to do that, then he or she is not in the realm of scientific research. So that's the second step, hypothesis. Now we'll come to that a little later. So the third step, because I think the point about scientific research, the critique on scientific research. So here we are, research methods. Your research proposal or a synopsis. One of those very important sections is research methods. As several scholars point out, including the document that I have just mentioned, research methods is often reduced to a ritualistic account in 3-4 lines, even in the best of the universities in this country, in social science. So this study uses this method, this study uses this technique, that's it. It's your research, it's no one else's research. So I think what is more important is whatever method, whatever methodological tradition that you are indicating, whatever method that you are mentioning, whatever technique that you are specifying, you need to demonstrate as to how this method or this combination of methods or this technique or this combination of techniques is best suited, is most appropriate for a research design of this kind. So I think that justification of research methods is more important. So as Professor Varun Sani would say, not just to make a mention of the methods. It's not just about a list, a laundry list. It's about justifying. It's about rationalizing. It's about defending as to why this method is required. This combination of methods is required. The point that needs to be mentioned here is there are different methodological traditions. But I think we are mostly tuned or accustomed to a positivist methodological tradition. Apart from positivism, we have interpretivism, we have critical social science. Perhaps it's a good idea in the section on research methods to indicate as to in which of these traditions, in which of these perspectives your research is primarily anchored in or grounded in. Is it positivism? Is it interpretivism? Is it critical social science? Is it grounded in a particular theoretical perspective? Is it critical theory? What strand of critical theory? Is it foundationalist critical theory? Is it anti-foundationalist critical theory? Is it Frankfurt School? Or is it a subaltern strand of critical theory? Again, I think to quote Professor Varun Sani, you need to be very clear-cut. We should write what we mean, and we should mean what we write. There should be no subtlety. So, as he would say, I mean, we are not writing a column for the New York Times or the Times of India or for the Hindu newspaper. There's no point in keeping the readers guessing. Right? A clear indication, as Einstein would say, repetition is preferable to elegance. You could repeat a point or reiterate a point, but you could never come up with a very ambiguous statement. Because mind you, whoever is reading a research proposal is not necessarily a specialist. And I'm talking about a research proposal in a much larger context. Maybe it is to get funding for postdoctoral research, maybe it is for getting admission, What makes us think that because we are in the subject of politics and international relations, the reader may also be from that area or arena? Not necessarily. He or she could be a historian. He or she could be an anthropologist. And I think the point, of course, this document on the art of writing research proposals, Adam Przeworski and Frank Solomon say, let us not make a virtue of mentioning or throwing jargons. As they say, disciplines have their own idiosyncrasies. Jargons need to be demystified. If we could minimize jargons, the better it is. So anyone must be able to understand what we write. I think that's very important. So methodological traditions indicate, is it interpretivism, is it positivism, is it critical social science? Methods, is it qualitative, is it quantitative, is it mixed methods? Or is it a combination of qualitative and quantitative? Then, of course, we talk about mixed methods. And mixed methods, I think the more important point is, mixed methods, I think, imply much more than a technical or an instrumental mixing of methods. It could be a within the method mixing, within qualitative. It could be within quantitative. It could be across the method mixing, qualitative and quantitative. But it could also imply that you could have a much more broader conversation across methods. So I think mixed methods provide that opportunity. They provide that space. Even pressing normative questions, substantive normative questions, such as social exclusion, such as discrimination, could be analyzed by using quantitative methods. Because quite often there is this resistance to quantitative methods, especially from critical theorists. But I think the point that I wish to make is simple. And for lack of time, I'm making that point as quickly as I can, is that qualitative and quantitative methods are not necessarily antithetical. And I think we should go beyond this divide between qualitative and quantitative to engage with certain normative issues. And I think the scholar that I have in mind, amongst others, is Professor Milja Kurki from Aberystwyth University, UK, who makes a case for a broader notion of causation. And I think she is making a critique on both reflectivist and rationalist. So I think you could go through one of her articles. That's a masterpiece yet again. So I think research methods, methodological traditions, theoretical perspectives. The moment you say that your proposal is grounded in a certain theoretical perspective, it adds value to your research design. Your research design becomes much more attractive. But again, theoretical perspectives, whether you are testing that theory. As Stephen Walt in the Renaissance of security studies would say, there are 3 levels in which you could engage with theory. The 3rd level is applying theory. The 2nd level is testing a theory. The 1st level is to formulate or come up with a theory. Let me share what I learned from Dr. Lee Jones from Queen Mary University of London. When we are talking about theorizing, we are talking about coming up with fine-grained explanations, right? The conditions under which you could explain a certain phenomenon, right? So I think the devil is in the details. The beauty of the theory lies in its nuances, in its nitty-gritties, right? Then again, when it comes to the section on methods, techniques. Is it a case study? At a point of time, case study would be considered primarily as qualitative method, not any longer. Is it a single case study? Is it a multiple case study? Justifying a case study is very important. And if it is a single case study, the level of justification ought to be more robust. If it is a multiple case study, if it is a comparative study, you should clearly say as to why you're choosing X, Y, Z instead of A, B, C, for instance. What explains the choice of cases? The choice of cases should never ever be easy cases. So you're not necessarily choosing a case because that would easily prove your hypothesis. Because mind you, we should do everything possible to disprove our hypothesis, not to prove our hypothesis. If you go by Popper, for instance, right? So I think case study is very important. Then interviews, is it about interviews? Is it about survey research? What kind of a sampling technique it is? Is it ethnography? Herein, I would like to mention the brilliant contribution of Morgan Brigg and Roland Blaker on autoethnography, 2010 Review of International Studies, wherein they make this point. It's a fantastic article. I think the larger point is this, which is that the suspension of self is unnecessary. But we have been told, we have been retold, we have been trained, we have been endlessly trained to think that whatever experiences we carry as a researcher should be kept at bay, should be suspended. They say that's not necessary. So I think I would suggest that you read that. As to why, for instance, the writings, the works of Dr. Ambedkar or the works of Periyar, EVR, or Rabindranath Tagore or any other such scholarly thinker, why are they considered the way they are considered? Precisely because they are authentic. So I think for Ambedkar or for Periyar, it is not an abstract engagement with social reality. It is born out of experience. So then again, review of literature, that's the point. Now, whether you do have space in your research proposal to have a section on review of literature, that depends on the length of the proposal. Review of literature should never be considered as a summary. Again, I'm saying something that's counterintuitive. There is a tendency to consider review of literature as a neat, elegant summarization from one work to another, or maybe a different kind of a summary. The review of literature should ideally mount a critique on the state of the art. What are the gaping gaps in the literature? In what manner is the literature deficient? In what manner is it illuminating? And as Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan would say, that first you need to have a clear-cut question. And if you go with that kind of a question, and if you dig deeper into the literature, do you find the answers? So this is the question I had. And I'm surveying the literature, but I don't get those answers. And that's why this question becomes significant. Again, review of literature, the point that Adam Przeworski and others also point out, should also provide ample scope for alternative perspectives. Research is not a narcissistic exercise. Research is an exercise which is grounded primarily in ethics, which is anchored primarily in humility. We may disagree with alternative perspectives, but at least they should be mentioned. There's an article, how to write an article and get published, I think in international security or something. What are the alternative perspectives? And how do you mount a critique on alternative perspectives? It's all right that you don't agree to them, but at least make a passing mention of those alternative perspectives. Bibliography, research proposal, I think there's a tendency amongst the scholarly community. Now I get to receive certain dissertations without bibliography. Bibliography is in fact more important than the substance, because if there is no bibliography, then research ethics is being violated. Right. So I think, as I think again, some scholars point out, any selection committee would say, okay, this is a work on caste in India. Do you have the recent work on this? Do you have annihilation of caste? Do you have Suraj Engde's work? So I think it's very important that your bibliography is representative. It is not about picking and choosing books or sources that we may like. It's not cherry picking. It's trying to make it as inclusive, as holistic, as rounded as possible. And I think meeting the stylistic requirements. I know that I've taken much longer than what I should have, but finally, 4 points. Research, I would imagine, rests on 4 foundations. And we could never ever compromise on these foundations. The first is research ethics, which translates into acknowledging sources, acknowledging our own work. Otherwise, it would be self-plagiarism, what the UGC has rightly stated. Research ethics in terms of interviewing respondents. Research ethics in terms of getting to know the opinion of the vulnerable sections of population. So if we are interviewing the vulnerable sections of population, are we in fact being ethical? Is research ethics being followed? Second point, methods, research methods, the justification for research methods, methodological rigor. The third point, originality. Are we writing something that others have not written so far? If the answer to that question, the question is no, we are writing the same thing, then let's not write. I mean, I'm just again reminded of the words of Professor Kanti Vajpayee here. Originality. The last point is how persuasive, how convincing is your research proposal to the other? And the other is more important than the self here. So I think that it's no good if the research proposal is convincing to you alone. As Professor Rajesh would say, you're not writing for yourself. And when it comes to the question of persuading, convincing, making a research proposal unassailable, robust, everything matters, not just the substance, but the presentation, but the packaging, the language. It has to be flawless language. We can't make this argument that English is a colonial language, so that does not matter. Then write in some other language, fine. But as long as you're writing in English, it has to be flawless. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. That was a very comprehensive, lecture, and I'm sure our interns must have gained a lot from your lecture today. And so therefore, sir, on behalf of CSPS, I would really like to thank you for accepting our invitation, giving your precious time. I know you were struggling with health and you had lots of other commitments as well. Yet you took out time and, spoke to our interns. So thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.